days. And I think it's safe to say that with very few exceptions, we have seen no interest at all by congressional Republicans in doing anything about the major deficits that we face as a society. And it's like Democrats feel, and the chairman alluded to this, that government has a role in trying to make life better for its citizens when it can. That we might want to try to make life a little bit easier if we can. And that's whether it concerns healthcare, education, paying for college, or early childhood education, housing, making it easier to vote, making it easier to breathe, making it easier to eat, making it easier to get child care, making it easier to retire with dignity, making it easier to get a wage you can live on. And on all of those, and virtually every other issue we discuss in this body, or that comes to this body, Republicans don't want to do anything. Nothing. It's not that they want to cooperate with us. They don't have any ideas to offer. They don't have anything to put on the table. So it's incredibly frustrating. I think all of us, I served in this body in the Senate as an aide many, many years ago. And it was a body in which both parties welcomed ideas from the other. And both parties had ideas. I worked for a Republican senator. We were in the minority then. Democrats wanted to do a lot of things. Republicans said, okay, well, let us make some contributions. Let us give you some ideas. Some were accepted, some weren't. We don't get any of that. We went through 8 years of being in the minority in this House of Representatives where I don't believe, other than cutting taxes, Republicans proposed anything except cutting, in addition to cutting taxes, cutting environmental regulations and trying to repeal Medicare without, Obamacare without any substitute. Dr. Burgess and I have been through many of those debates over the years. So when we say there'd love to be a bipartisan approach to some of these issues, it's kind of like pointless because there's been no interest indicated, again, over the last decade or more in dealing with these incredibly important national interests. And my ranking member, Mr. Smith, said during his thing, we passed the American Rescue Plan, which nobody wanted. That's not what the polling shows. Polling shows that it is overwhelmingly popular, that it benefited millions and millions of people, that it pulled millions of children out of poverty. Not permanently, that's what we want to do. Temporarily, we want to do it permanently. And the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan, and by the way, the Biden administration never called it infrastructure. They never called it infrastructure. It was the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan. Part of that involves infrastructure. But the notion was, the emphasis was, creating jobs, improving the economy, and improving families' lives. And that's what we're trying to do here. If there is any interest from Republicans in doing any of that, please speak up. Or just admit that you don't think the government, the federal government, has any interest in dealing with some of these challenges to the society that we live in and we want to improve. One other thing. There's a lot of focus on deficit and debt in this discussion. Ranking member said at the beginning, basically made a reference to families and small businesses. The federal government is not a family, and it's not a small business, and it's not a local government, and it's not a state government. It is the issuer of a fiat currency that we have total control of. We only borrow and spend in our own currency. We can spend whatever we need to spend in the interest of serving the American people. And I sat, and Mr. Cole has sat as well, back when Paul Ryan was chairman of this committee, and we heard all of his forecasts of doom and gloom because we were running up the deficit, we were going to crowd everything out, and interest rates were going to go crazy, and all this stuff was going to happen. And what do you know? We increased the national debt. We as a country doubled the national debt in about 12 years. Did any of that happen? Is our dollar weakened? Is our interest rates higher? No, interest rates are at historic lows. So I think you can make the case that a lot of people who talk about debt and deficits don't have any idea what they're talking about. And that we can look to somebody like Chairman Powell at the Fed, who said, we have the fiscal space to do what we need to do. And I think that's what we are proposing to do. We have serious deficits in this country. They are not necessarily financial deficits. They are deficits in our society. And we need to do something immediately to get a handle on them and to start correcting them.
I thank you for that. And yeah, I mean, basically, we're investing in people in this budget. We're investing in all the people in this country. And that's what I appreciate about it. So let me just a couple specific questions and then a comment. You mentioned the pieces, or you mentioned in passing, and I'd like you to get a little more specific, sort of the environmental aspect of this bill, because in Colorado, we're getting smoke from the big fires in Oregon and California, and what should be a pristine, beautiful day is just nothing but haze from these giant fires. So tell me some of the environmental aspects of this.
Well, first of all, let me say it's not just the fires in the West. It's they've had the worst flooding in Tennessee in history. We have severe storms. New York Central Park had the highest rainfall in a 2-hour period it's ever had. Central Park had flooding. We have one of the, if not the worst drought in the West that we've ever seen. I mean, we're kind of like whistling past the graveyard in this country in not being willing to tackle the problem of climate, because we're seeing the impact of climate change every day throughout our country. What this legislation does, among other things, is, for instance, put a very important emphasis on electric vehicles, charging stations, incentives for green power, and these are the things that I think are the kind of the low-hanging fruit that we would want to approach in trying to deal with climate. And the answers are, and these are some of the frustrating things. The answers always are, well, we only provide 25% of the greenhouse gases in the world, so why should we do anything? Because the other 75% aren't doing anything. And that's kind of the whistling past the graveyard, that we're the leading economy in the world still. We may not be in years to come, but if we don't start working on it and setting an example for the rest of the world, and I think we can, and we can with this bill, with this budget, that we are going to fail in dealing with climate. And then we have a different kind of world. The people are saying right now we've already passed the critical point, the point of no return in a warmer economy and a warmer world, and there are going to be places that by the end of the century will be uninhabitable. That's a pretty frightening prospect. I have a 2-year-old grandson, and I worry every day about what kind of world I'm leaving him.
But this budget does attempt to correct some of that and tackle it head on.
Exactly.
Okay. Last, just a comment on the inflation, and obviously, we've set kind of a 2% inflation. We want to have full employment. That's part of the law of this country. And we've seen, and I concur with you, that inflation is a concern. But deflation is a concern as well, which is what we began to see when we had the highest unemployment since the 30s, when COVID hit us. And we've seen an increase in the cost of toilet paper when COVID hit us. That inflated right out of the box because there was such high demand for that particular product, or masks, or whatever, because we've seen macroeconomics on steroids because of this virus. Because all of a sudden, all sorts of people do the same thing at the same time, and we don't have much of it. We saw lumber increase, just shot up like crazy as we came out of this pandemic for a variety of reasons, tariffs and the like. But we saw it shoot up. It's coming back down. So the best estimate by the Federal Reserve is that inflation is tapering even as we speak. And that's not to say that it isn't a concern. We should always be keeping an eye on these things. So we've seen that, and I just appreciate Mr. Yarmouth, you all tackling this big subject and investing in everyday Americans to make their lives better. With that, I yield back.
One comment, if I may, on the inflation question. You're right. Everybody needs to be concerned about inflation. That's the one, I guess, constraint on how much money we can inject into the economy at any particular time. But what we've seen recently is, I think, when you break it down, certainly leads to the conclusion that this is most likely, not certainly, but most likely transitory. For instance, 1/3 of the inflation rate over the last couple of months has been in used cars. And used cars, what happened was two things. One is when the pandemic hit, nobody was renting cars. All the rental car companies sold their cars, sold their fleets because they couldn't maintain them and they didn't need them. And then you also had the problem with semiconductors, chips, chips, coming over and the shortage of those. So when the economy started to rebound, all of a sudden people were traveling again. They wanted to rent cars. Rental car companies had to go out and buy them. They couldn't buy new cars because the companies didn't have the chips to actually manufacture the new cars. And so you had this huge spike in in used car prices, up to about 20% of the prices. So you had that very unique situation. Lumber was another good example. When the pandemic hit, nobody thought there was going to be a demand for construction. Well, so the lumber yards, one of the things they did was they cut back on production because they didn't think they were going to need anything. At the same time, a lot of builders, were actually buying long-term contracts, driving the price up. And that turned out to be counterindicated. They didn't work out that way. So now you're right, prices ran up. Now they're way down. They're still a little bit higher than they were before the pandemic, but not that much. So, you also had the last couple of months' numbers, May, June, July, compared to May, June, July of 2020. You didn't have the compared to May, June, July of 2019. If you did, there would be virtually no inflation. But you were comparing them to months when the prices tanked because there wasn't anybody. In certain areas, hotels, nobody was going to hotels. Nobody was flying planes. Very few people were driving. So you had all of these depressed months throughout the economy last spring, and those are the numbers that we're comparing them to now. I think you're right. Most of the Fed's looking at this carefully. They're not alarmed yet, but they're being very vigilant, as they should be, and we should be vigilant too. But I think to try and make blanket statements that what we're proposing here will drive significant inflation in the economy is totally unjustified and is not provable by anybody at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Yarmouth. I yield back.
Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The problem, Mr. Yarmouth, is by the time that it is provable, it becomes very, very difficult to reverse it. And you're probably not old enough to have lived through the inflation of the Jimmy Carter years. I
think I'm older than you are, Mr. Burgess.
And it is extremely difficult to reverse that once it becomes embedded in the economy. The amount of federal spending that has already passed within the past year, and I guess I would go back to March 27th of 2020 when we passed the CARES Act. Full disclosure, I voted for the CARES Act. I wasn't sure what this pandemic was dealing to us. I haven't voted for any of the other so-called coronavirus response bills since then because I have been concerned about the amount of money that we're pushing out into the economy. And when I talk to constituents back home, in fact, I talked to a farmer just yesterday who cuts the hay at a place next to mine, and he said, I just need you to know this. You can't buy fuel. You can't buy pesticides, chemicals. You can't buy materials. Everything has gotten not just high in cost, but it's not available. And my worry is that we've pushed so much money out into the economy so fast, not giving the economic engines a chance to begin spinning again and begin doing their work again. We've pushed so many dollars out the door that it has had this unintended consequence. Yes, there's some things, the chip shortage sort of defies logic, and I get that that's been a problem, but this is a lot more than just chips. This is air filters, this is oil filters, this is fuel filters, according to the farmer that I talked to yesterday. We all know the cost of fuel itself is, where I live, it's about $1 more for regular unleaded gasoline than it was a year ago. So all of that is going to have an effect. Let me just share with you one of the places where I hear a lot, and we're all concerned about the coronavirus, we're all concerned about our hospitals being overtaxed. But one of the problems that they've encountered is they can't keep their personnel. We've pushed so much federal money out there that these large hiring consortia are using to attract nurses, technicians from one area of the country to another, offering extremely high rates, and I don't blame them. I don't blame them at all, but this is a reality of what is happening on the ground and what the conditions that we're dealing to our constituents. And I think it is something that maybe we ought to, hit the pause button for a little while. What happened with the coronavirus, the economy was great, coronavirus comes on, we've all got to scramble to try to make sure things don't go so bad so fast that they're not recoverable, but we also have an obligation. We don't do the kind of work, are you still on Ways and Means? We certainly don't do the work in my Committee of Energy and Commerce like we used to do. We don't authorize expenditures. We do emergency, with all deference to appropriators, we appropriate money and push the dollars out the door and then tell the agency to do something good with it. But we don't authorize those expenditures like we used to. And as a consequence, then it's just hard to know whether or not what you're doing is going to have a beneficial or deleterious effect. Look, I know that this bill that we're talking about now, and I don't quite understand all of the political machinations that are going on behind the scenes. This one and another bill with that's our amended highway bill have to go pretty much simultaneously, or people aren't going to be in a mind to support one or the other, or one without the other. I don't know that. I'm not part of those internal discussions. But you brought up the Affordable Care Act, and this does remind me a lot of when the Affordable Care Act came back over from the Senate, and not a word could be changed over here in the House. We just simply had to rubber stamp what the Senate sent us. I get that same uneasy feeling here, that we're going to have to hit that rubber stamp on the infrastructure bill, perhaps on this budget bill, that there's not the political space to go back and negotiate. There's not the political space to go to a conference committee. It literally is going to pass on a party line vote, and I don't need to remind you that the partisan makeup of both the House and the Senate is pretty narrow right now. So it's on a knife's edge. But am I correct on that we will not be able to change one word of either bill as it now has come to us from the Senate, without risking having to go back and start the whole series over again?
Well, with regard to the budget resolution, which I presented today, I can't speak to the bipartisan infrastructure legislation or others, but we will actually be writing the legislation here in the House. We have to go first because the bill will contain revenue measures. So we actually will be writing that bill between now and September 15th and then debating it on the floor. So we not only will have a say as to what goes in it, we're going to create what goes in it.
Yeah, up to a point. As I read the bill, and every part of this deficit neutral reserve, blah, 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 starts out with, "The chairman of the committee on the budget of the Senate may revise the allocations of a committee or committee's aggregates and other appropriate levels in the resolution." Every single section reads the same way. Bernie Sanders is writing your bill. You're not writing it.
We're not writing the resolution. We're writing the legislation that is actually what matters. We have 13 committees right now working on legislation that implements all the instructions that were provided in this budget resolution. So the other committee I serve on.
To reclaim my time, does the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee retain the power to rewrite the allocations of every jot and tittle of whatever it is you're going to produce? Short answer is yes, which is not satisfying in any way. I mean, this is supposedly coming out of the greatest deliberative body in the world, and they have simply abdicated all of their authority to it might be a fine individual. I don't know him. I served only with him for one term over here on the House side, but we're abdicating all of that responsibility to the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee.
As you know, Dr. Burgess, the Senate has no margin in terms of partisan capability. They've done their own negotiations and decided what levels of investment they can pass in the Senate. I don't know that Bernie Sanders is going to have that change. And by the way, reserve funds don't change the instructions. The instructions are what they are. So Education Labor Committee, I also serve on, will be responsible for drafting legislation to spend $779 billion over 10 years. And Energy and Commerce has a substantial amount of money instructed, $496 billion to spend as well. So that legislation is going to change and is going to be created, and we'll vote on it in the House. We may or may not be able to pass it in the House, given the partisan margin. But the House is going to have a significant say in what the final product that's considered by the House and Senate.
May I ask the chairman, will the chairman permit me to ask him a question? And I apologize, I got here.
You can always ask me a question.
When I got here a few minutes late, are we doing a single bill for both the reconciliation budget and the highway, a single rule for the highway bill?
Yeah, we're going to do a rule that will deal with the reconciliation bill, the highway bill, and the Voting Rights Act, because voting rights is very important, given the effort by some states to basically trample on people's rights to vote. So all those three things will be in this rule today.
So it becomes very, very difficult to get the fine level of detail that might be required to provide all of those fine things that you suggested at the beginning of your talk, that the good things we want to do for people.
Oh, we will be creating them, and I've spoken on a number of occasions that we have to be careful.
Yeah, reclaim my time. With all due respect, okay. This is a very blunt instrument. Now, Ranking Member Smith, let me ask you a question, because I kind of came in on the end of it as far as the taxes are concerned. Is this going to raise enough in tax revenue to offset everything that's going to be in front of us?
When you look at the budget resolution, it proposes, this is math, it's very simple. What you have before you is a bunch of numbers, and it shows the budget over 10 years. And it creates the instructions for the reconciliation bill that's $3.5 trillion of spending. Under the budget resolution, which is before you, it proposes $68 trillion worth of spending, which is record spending in history over a 10-year period. $68 trillion, and then it has the highest sustained amount of the tax burden in history. And even with the high tax burden that's proposed in this budget, you still will have $17 trillion added to the deficit over the 10-year window. Because on average at minimum, your deficit is $1.6 trillion a year for the next 10 years. And that adds up to 17 trillion. So the math does add up, regardless of what the chairman might have said in prior statements. We can use a calculator and figure that one out. And so that, even with the tax increases, through the blueprint of the budget resolution, you still add $17 trillion to the deficit, plus you have the highest tax burden in the history of the United States.
So even in spite of all of the taxes that you're raising, you're ending up with that as a net figure, 17 trillion.
A net
in the
deficit
red.
of 17 trillion that will be added to the debt. And CBO's Congressional Budget Office has highlighted numerous items about the effects of debt. The chairman said earlier in his questioning that there's no economists or folks out there that don't see how debt affects people. Well, the CBO said that increasing debt will lower Americans' wages $9,000 a year. That's a direct impact of who we represent. And CBO said that. CBO also predicts that our national debt will be $133 trillion by mid-century without additional changes. Think about that.
Yeah, so mid-century, that's 30 years from now, right?
Yep.
What the national debt today is 30 trillion?
29.
29?
Right at a little less than 29.
And what is your projected figure for 30 years from now?
To add 17 trillion to that in 10 years. In 30 years, CBO says it's 133 trillion.
And, we toss those numbers around. No one can comprehend that type of numeric value. You just can't.
And every economist will say at our level of debt and spending will lead to a financial crisis. Even CBO said that. With rising debt will lead to a financial crisis. They couldn't predict when, but they said that it would.
So let me just ask you a question. In the old days when we used to do budgets at the beginning of the year and talk about things in a more normal, rational way, there's always a complaint that we only control, a third of our budget. The discretionary amount of dollars that we spend are only about a third of what the federal government actually spends because so much is on autopilot. It strikes me that driving these programs that have been discussed, we're going to increase the amount of money that will be driven on autopilot, that we as members of Congress and future members of Congress will never actually have the ability to impact. Those numbers will just simply be set somewhere legislatively in entitlement spending that will continue to accrue, and you could cut your discretionary, cut your defense, your veteran spending, labor age spending to zero, and you would still be in deficit because there would not be a way to raise enough taxes to cover what is on autopilot. In the American Rescue Plan, we increased the amount of dollars going to subsidize in the individual market, the marketplace insurance policies. One of the big complaints about the Affordable Care Act was people couldn't afford it, and once you got outside the subsidy window, it became extremely onerous. So we've increased that. Democrats increased that in the American Rescue Plan, but it was only for a period of 2 years. So I think, Mr. Yarmouth, I heard you reference that you wanted to do more than that, but that is, of course, adding to the burden of spending that's on autopilot or entitlement spending that already exists, a baseline that's already high, and you're going to make that higher. Do I understand that conceptually correctly?
I think the entire caucus, virtually the entire caucus, would like to see the child tax credit made permanent, yes.
Child tax credit made permanent, the increased subsidies for people now in the Affordable Care Act. It used to be a family of four earning above $96,000 a year was outside the subsidy window and got no help. Now that number has gone up to $250,000, that earnings for a family of four. So that's taking in a lot more people than ever before. All of that expires in 2 years, so something will have to be done. Your proposal is to do that now in this mammoth budget. But again, I'd come back to the central point. We're adding dollars to the part of the budget that's on autopilot that future members of Congress will not be able to, I mean, they'll have no say. Those dollars are already spent. They're already obligated. They're already out the door, if you will. So again, conceptually, do I have that correctly?
You do, and I'd like to note that what you've just said is an important aspect to what we're doing, and that is people are worried about the deficit, and people worry about the deficit because they think it's some like gray cloud hanging over us. When the federal government runs a deficit, who runs the surplus that is created by that deficit? For every deficit, somebody's deficit is somebody else's surplus. That's math. And in this case, it's the American people's surplus. It is the parents and the children.
No, I'm not sure I'm going. I'm not sure I'm going with you on that.
Give me an alternative. What it is? Where's this money going? It's not going to anybody but the American people.
On a smaller scale, when you run a business, if you
We're
decide
not a business, sir.
If you decide to expand, you do a capital expenditure. Perhaps you go into debt for that capital expenditure. You hope that is something that's going to help you increase revenues down the road. But if you use those dollars simply for, not simply, but if you use those dollars for your electric bill, paying your employees, then those dollars are gone. They're not there to generate additional revenue for you. And again, even Bill Clinton several years ago.
You don't think powering your business allows you to make more money?
So Bill Clinton several years ago said our job at the federal government was not simply to consume the bounty of today. And I think that conceptually is something that we need to pay attention to, because we are spending ourselves into we're painting ourselves into a corner. It's going to be almost impossible to get out of. Mr. Chairman, you've been very indulgent. I'm going to yield back my time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I want to thank you, Chairman, for your leadership. I just have a few questions to clear up a few. The first thing actually is I was struck by the argument I've heard a few times now by people defending the economy that President Biden inherited from Donald Trump. And what they say is that there were good economic figures before COVID-19 hit. And that sounds to me like saying Herbert Hoover had the greatest stock market in the history of the country before the stock market collapsed in the Great Depression. If you want to take credit for the unemployment rate low, don't you also have to take credit or blame for the unemployment rate when it's through the roof? And does that make any sense, simply to say, well, the last administration had good figures before everything went to hell in a handbasket?
Yeah, I don't know. I will say, Mr. Raskin, that you raised an important point, and that is that actually the growth under the Trump administration was actually barely a tenth of a percent or 0.2% higher than it was during the Obama administration. So there's virtually no difference in the performance of the economy under Donald Trump pre-pandemic as there was under the Obama administration.
And then, of course, the pandemic took place during the Trump administration. And if you're holding a president responsible or accountable or praiseworthy for things that take place during the administration, you've got to hold accountable and responsible for those things that go wrong, too, because crises do happen. Sometimes those crises relate to one's own irresponsibility and criminal recklessness, or to things that maybe you inherited from a administration. Let me ask you this, Mr. Yarmouth. Do you still have people on your committee who are denying the existence of climate change, or are they just being silent about it now? For a long time, there were people who were, invoking all kinds of fake science, claiming fraudulent things. Now, with record flooding and record drought and record forest fire, two of my kids are out in Nevada and they basically can't go outside because of the smoke inhalation. It's an extremely dangerous situation in lots of parts of the country because of all these climate change related weather calamities that are taking place. Do we still have people who are trying to deny the existence of climate, or are they just maintaining a kind of demure silence at this point and basically letting the other party deal with it?
Well, I haven't surveyed any of the members of the committee, not to mention the Republican members, but I suspect that most of the Republican members of the committee would admit that that climate change is real, that the country is suffering from it. I think there's less of an agreement as to what extent human behavior is the cause of that. But the most important thing is there doesn't seem to be, among any Republicans I've heard or talked to, any sense of urgency about acting on it or any sense of being willing to actually make the kind of fundamental changes, like, for instance, encouraging renewable power, electric vehicles, and so forth, that we know will have an impact on the emission of global gases. So while, again, I don't know how they feel personally, in terms of their policy response, it has been sorely lacking.
Okay, and I've got one final question for you, Mr. Yarmuth. I think the public is pretty realistic at this point about all of the rhetoric about deficit and debt. We didn't hear any of that rhetoric during the Trump administration when they added $2 trillion in deficit because of their tax cut for the biggest corporations in the land in a totally economically regressive way. It really just comes down to different philosophies because both parties are willing to make expenditures, but traditionally the GOP has wanted to invest in the wealthiest part of society on the theory that wealth and growth would trickle down to the vast majority of the people. But the Democratic Party, going back to Franklin D. Roosevelt, has said that we should be investing in the American people from the bottom up, and then the rich will undoubtedly be able to take care of themselves and get richer, but you need to invest in the needs of the vast majority of the American people. And what I like about what you've brought forward here is a resolution that allows for investment in the real American society, in the ailing infrastructure, and in the economic determinants that will make everybody prosper together. And I just wonder, is that a fair approximation of the public philosophy that you've brought to this task?
I think that is an approximation. I will relate one story I've told hundreds of times, but I'll do it again because it seems appropriate here. My brother, who has been very successful in the restaurant business, back in 2008, before then, he always voted Republican because he wanted to pay less tax. And back in 2008, in the summer during the campaign, he called me and he said, "John, you'll be pleased to know that Judy, his wife, Judy and I are maxing out to Barack Obama and we're voting for all Democrats this year." And I said, "That's great, Bob. What was your epiphany?" And he said, "Well, I finally figured out that if nobody can afford barbecue, it doesn't matter what my taxes are." And that is not only, I think, a fun story, it also happens to have the benefit of being true and very insightful. And that's where we are as a country. When you have the kind of disparity of wealth that we have in this country, and it up until very recently has been continued to get worse, and so much wealth is concentrated at the top. The idea that we can help the American people, the vast majority of the American people, by making life easier for the wealthiest people is something that is almost laughable. And as a matter of fact, those people who, back during the Reagan administration, conceived the notion of trickle-down economics, David Stockman and Bruce Bartlett, among others, have said more recently that that was a very flawed flawed ideology, and it never was valid, and it certainly isn't today. So, yes, the tax cuts that the Republicans passed in 2017 did not do anything like what they were projected to do in terms of creating vast amounts of new investment in the economy and so forth. As a matter of fact, most of the money that corporations received through the cutting the tax rate from 35 to 21%, which, by the way, they didn't even ask for, that was spent paying dividends and buying back their stock. So this is a reversal of that philosophy. I think it's long past due that we changed our perspective and said the investments this country needs to make are in its people, not in its not in the beneficiaries of the capitalist system that have done so well.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, I just want to close by quoting something I read in the newspaper this morning from our late lost colleague, Representative Paul Mitchell from Michigan, who made a call for constructive bipartisanship before his death. He left the Republican Party, he became an independent, and he said, you have to choose whether or not to love people or to go through life just trying to get political gain. And it was a call to both sides to engage in bipartisanship and to try to find common ground in the interest of serving the people and not just particular interest groups. And I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And in your honor, I am sitting here drinking polar water. I just want you to know that it is, as always, delicious.
If you come to Worcester, we'll have a parade for you because you've been such a booster of one of our big industries. So thank you so much.
Sounds
You could
good.
be drinking
Sounds
my
good.
home product as well, you know.
Not while he's testifying. Not while he's asking questions.
That's right. We'll wait till after. I was gonna yield to Mr. Raskin to see what decade the wallpaper is from. Mr. Raskin.
I was bottom of the totem pole, and I ended up in my youngest daughter's room, so she chose it. You have to take it up the back of it.
Sounds good. Just giving you a hard time. Well, Ranking Member Smith, I know you briefly were discussing the debt ceiling. I wasn't sure if you wanted to just take a moment and expand on it, or do you feel that you've exhausted the topic? I just wanted to give you the opportunity to expand if you so choose.
Representative, in regards to the debt ceiling, it expired on July 31st. The Treasury Secretary has said that using extraordinary measures that we have until October 1st to address it. And so it's definitely an issue that we should be addressing right now, along with funding government for the next fiscal year, since we only have 9 legislative days that's officially on the calendar to address both of those manners. But instead, we're looking at spending additional dollars that don't address either one of those issues or any of the crises that our country's facing right now, whether it's the border crisis, the inflation crisis, the Afghanistan crisis, or the energy crisis. In fact, what we have before us are items that only make those crises hurt the American people even more.
And then, Ranking Member Smith, from my understanding, there's a faction of the Democratic Party that might not vote for this. In your estimate, are there the votes to even pass this? And I hate to ask you to speculate, but I'm going to yield to you and just see if you have any thoughts.
Wow, that's a great question, Representative. No one has the crystal ball, but if you read the headlines, especially an op-ed that came out last night from 9 moderate Democrats, I think that Speaker Pelosi is still at the opportunity trying to get the votes for this budget resolution. And we may just be having this hearing and may not actually even vote on the budget resolution this week. Because if you do the math, Speaker Pelosi can only lose 4 people and she can't pass it. And if you look at the last budget resolution, there were 2 Democrats that voted against it, 1 voted present. And so if you can only lose 4, and there's 3 Democrats that have said under no circumstance will they vote for this budget resolution, She can only lose one more of the 11. So we'll see if people, based on what they have said publicly in the newspaper, follows through. But I would say Speaker Pelosi has her work cut out for her on whether she can pass this budget resolution or not, and especially trying to bring forth Bernie's budget, where it doesn't even allow a member of the House to amend it, but allow Bernie full flexibility to draft the budget for the United States government. I think that terrifies numerous of our moderate Democrat colleagues that I've been talking with over the last several weeks.
Hey, thanks, Ranking Member Smith. I appreciate it. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Many of the things we're talking about here, whether in the infrastructure bill or in the proposed budget package, are hugely, hugely popular with the American people. And in addition to the hard infrastructure package, if we're going to build back better, we need to pass things like the child tax credit and addressing the care economy and our schools so that everyone can participate in that economy. I guess, Mr. Yarmouth, one of the really popular elements of the American Rescue Plan is the child tax credit. And many of us hope to make it permanent as we move forward because, one of the critical areas we need to improve in this country to, start to come even with the rest of the developed world is how we treat our children, and particularly addressing the huge number of children in Pennsylvania and across the country who live in poverty and in fact live in deep poverty. Can you tell us a little bit about what we're seeing with respect to the impact of the child tax credit that was implemented with the American Rescue Plan and what it could do going forward?
Well, thank you for the question, and I think there has been a substantial amount of news coverage on this over the last couple of months, and the number of parents whose life has been made much fuller and much more secure because of the child tax credit. I know in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, more than 100,000 children were lifted out of poverty by that payment of $300 or $250, depending on the age of the child. And again, that's only a temporary reprieve for them, but by expanding that child tax credit, as we propose to do in this resolution, we would continue that, I think, remarkable feat of raising many, many families out of poverty, and most importantly, providing support for the most innocent of our citizens. These are the children who can't control anything about their lives. They can't control what their parents' income would be. They can't compare they can't control what their parents' initiative will be, but we should support them because no one else is. And these children are not just human beings, of course they are, and we cherish them. We should cherish them, but they're also our future. They're the future of our employment base, they're the future of our tax base, and if we don't make sure they have the kind of foundation, whether it's educationally or health or otherwise, we're going to be in much more serious condition economically a generation from now when they are the workers that we're relying on. So there's an enormous benefit to not just those children and those families, but to the society as a whole and to our economy.
Well, that certainly tracks with what I'm hearing in my district. The regular payments that are coming to people seems to really be having a big impact. We've seen data that children are less hungry, so there's that humanitarian aspect. But we're also hearing that extra money is helping moms and dads go back to work because they're able now to afford childcare, where they couldn't before. So it's helping our current employment, and then, as you said, making sure kids have a healthy start, a good start, increases their prospects moving forward. I just wanted to give you a minute. I don't have further questions for you, but was there anything else in the colloquy that you wanted to respond to?
Well, not necessarily that, but I do want to make a comment about the debt ceiling. The debt
Thought you
ceiling,
might.
if I can, the debt ceiling is something that only the United States, of all the the advanced nations in the world has the way we currently have it. There are a couple of other countries that have a debt ceiling, a statutory debt ceiling, but they have basically a system where when they appropriate money that creates a debt larger than their ceiling, it automatically expands. We're the only country in the world that has a debt ceiling that actually provides the opportunity for us to default on our obligations. We have raised the debt ceiling. Until the last 10 or 15 years, we raised it routinely over the entire history of the debt ceilings, 85, 90 times. All it does right now is to give members an opportunity for mischief, for trying to get leverage in a political, for brinkmanship. And that's what we're seeing out of the Senate right now when Mitch McConnell has said that they're not going to have one Republican vote in the Senate to raise the debt ceiling. If you think about the outrageousness of that alone, you wonder what planet Republicans are living on. The idea that Republicans, not one Republican in the United States Senate, would vote to recognize the obligations of this government, in fact, obligations that they helped create. They voted for the CARES Act, many of them did, in the Senate, and now they're not going to pay the debt that they helped accrue. I mean, it sounds like the Donald Trump means of doing business has been contagious in the Republican caucus or conference in the Senate, and we'll see what happens in the House. But it's outrageous. I remember back in 2013 when we had the same exact situation, and we shut the government down for 5 weeks. It was disastrous for the economy. It was disastrous for credibility in government. It shook financial markets. We can't afford to do that. It's the only responsible thing. I mean, I think we ought to get rid of the debt ceiling. Again, it provides absolutely no benefit. If you look at the history, we've had it for an awful long time, and what has happened, it hasn't, the initial purpose was to help restrain spending. It hasn't done that. So I don't know what the purpose of it is, except to give some kind of a power of brinkmanship over members of either party to use. So I just wish that people would come to their senses and say, this is something we have to do, it's non-negotiable, and it's also something that I think if you vote against raising the debt ceiling, you have violated your oath of office.
Well, as someone who came to Congress to try to get things done for my constituents, I'm not really happy about the number of these tools, whether it's the filibuster or the debt ceiling, that are just being misused for political brinksmanship. Particularly when a substantial amount of that debt stems from the $1.7 trillion tax giveaway that happened in 2017. So thank you for your efforts in this regard, and with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess I would just, I appreciate that Dr. Burgess had brought up the issue as I was looking through about the issues of the provisions that allow the Senate budget chair the ability to revise allocations without, and then I believe it was Ranking Member Smith who mentioned that without any House input, we have just this resolution just hands over that power to change any of those numbers to the Senate budget chair, and that is a real concern. But and I'm glad it came out and that folks had mentioned it. But just Ranking Member Smith, I was just wondering, can you talk about some of the common budget practices that may have been eliminated or had loopholes created in this resolution?
In regards to the common budget practices, the fact that it never came to the Budget Committee, the fact that we've never had a hearing on this budget resolution, and the fact that it spends $68 trillion worth of funding, and this is the first hearing it's had in the House of Representatives, and it's going straight to the floor, with no amendments by any Democrats or Republicans. I think that that's a broken process. However, it was crafted by Bernie Sanders. That's why it's Bernie's budget. It came from him. He's the one that sponsored the legislation. Didn't even have a hearing in his own committee. That's a problem.
Well, and thank you, Ranking Member. I have real concerns about the transparency and about the process, just not the way that I am used to dealing with the budget and getting input from the public and input from other members of the legislative body. So I have real strong concerns about that. And I just wanted, Ranking Member, to give you the opportunity to add to anything. I know you've been listening very politely to a lot of the questions and the responses, and I'm wondering if you had anything else you'd like to add.
You know, Representative, I appreciate that. I will point out that there's been a lot of talk that Republicans never have items to offer. Republicans offer items all the time. Just in the last couple weeks, every Republican member of the House Budget Committee sent a letter to every member of House leadership and Senate leadership coming up with various budgetary fiscal restraints and reforms prior to the deadline of the debt limit on July 31st. And we've heard crickets from Democrats. And this was before the deadline. And so the fact that anyone will say that Republicans aren't offering proposals and coming up with ideas, that's clearly false. Just because you don't like our ideas or our proposals doesn't mean we're not offering them. And unfortunately, the way this Congress has been acting, Representative, is that bipartisanship only exists if you agree with everything that we propose as the ruling party. That is what happens. And that's why there's never been a hearing in the Budget Committee on this budget resolution, is because they don't want us to offer a counter. They don't want us to offer input. They don't want us to represent our 750,000 constituents. They want their vision, and they want their command and their control over the lives and livelihoods of all Americans. And that's how their form of governance is. And it's not the form of governance that we all have suggested. And so because it's a different belief, we're not being bipartisan. But just give us the opportunity to present our ideas instead of just railroading us.
And thank you, Ranking Member. I would just like to say that I absolutely think this is just unfair to the American people, the way we are handling this, that there is no opportunity for 200 and some Congress people who represent them to have any input, and for them to have any understanding, to be able to watch those, and to have any understanding of what's going on with this budget. It is just rammed through without any kind of input. And so I appreciate the frustration I hear in your voice on how this is put together. And with that, I would like to yield to Ranking Member.
I don't think it's just the Republicans that are shut out. It's almost every member. Look, when you don't bring a bill to a committee, you shut out every member of that committee, Democrat or Republican. When we have a closed rule, which we will surely have, you shut out every member's ability to do it. So it's an institutional problem, not just a partisan problem. And this idea of, again, bringing something of this magnitude without moving it through either budget committee in either chamber, and then allowing other members that aren't privileged to be on those committees to also participate in some form or fashion, I think it's an institutional failing. Just my opinion, but thank the gentlelady for yielding and yield back.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member. I appreciate that, and I will. With that, I will yield my time.
Thank you. If I could just say, because I feel now like I want to move from coffee to the beverage of Kentucky. The point I think we were trying to make is simply that if there's going to be bipartisanship, then there has to be goodwill and good intentions in trying to craft something where, in fact, at the end of the day, you can get bipartisan support to pass it. That's what we tried to do on the January 6th Commission. I mean, literally giving the Republicans everything they wanted, and the answer was no. I mean, we see what's happening with the suspension bills. I mean, and I'll quote Chip Roy, congressman from Texas. He says, honestly, right now, for me, the next 18 months, our job is to do everything we can to slow all of that down to get to December 2022. Not to find common ground to pass bipartisan legislation, but basically to shut everything down so that nothing can be done. So yeah, I mean, people, it goes back to what you said about the Affordable Care Act when Charlie Rangel said, you got ideas, but is there any way any of you ever going to get to yes on this? And the answer is no. So essentially negotiate against yourself, compromise your values for what? To get a no vote at the end of the day? And I think that that's the deal here. I mean, look, I said it at the very beginning, I think that the two parties do not share the same values in terms of what is necessary. And by the way, let me just say this. I don't want to go back to the pre-COVID economy. Whether it's under Trump, I'll even say I don't want to go back to Obama's economy because that was not acceptable. I mean, before COVID, 37 million Americans were food insecure or hungry in the richest country in the history of the world. I'm ashamed of that. We all should be ashamed of that. So that's not the economy we want to go back to, where people working 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet. I mean, we want to do better. And some of the things in this bill that we're trying to move forward can help families, be whole and be able to earn a decent living. So I just, this whole bipartisan stuff, I mean, I want it. I want the institution to go back to that. We all do. But boy, it requires good faith on both sides. And we have, I mean, I just gave you a recent example of something that, where we thought we had bipartisanship, and at the last minute, no, we don't. And I think, so I think we need to move forward, and we'll see where the votes are. And Mr. Cole.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I don't want to be argumentative, but I do want to take exception. Let's give you an example. Look, when I was chairman of the Labor Aid Subcommittee, we passed, and that's a controversial bill. That's the biggest domestic spending bill we have. It touches on a lot of things that are important to a lot of members, and frankly, where we have a lot of different opinions. I passed it 4 times. My then ranking member, who's now the chair of the full committee, Rosa DeLore, voted for the final passage on all 4 occasions. 2 occasions that she was chairman, we've passed it twice. I voted for the final passage on both of those bills, and many of my Republican colleagues did as well. We did the CARES Act together during a Republican majority. I mean, there are lots of examples, and I will also grant you there are situations that are partisan. I mean, you've made a decision to do that here. We did that on the tax bill, be fair. 2017, we didn't get any Democratic buy-in or help. It was, so this is a sweeping change. This is really big. And so I will grant you there's not going to be much bipartisanship here. That was your decision when you decided to go this big in a narrow majority. It's your decision when you strip out all the pro-life protections and appropriations bills that have been there. That is going to turn into a partisan vote. Fair enough. If you have the votes to do it and that's what you believe, that's fair. But this idea that one side is that there's never any bipartisanship, that's just not the case. But it depends on the issue. This is not one, and I would say that submit the same thing. We did 5 COVID relief bills together last year, totaling $4 trillion. An awful lot of bipartisanship. We did it with a Democratic House, a Republican Senate, Republican President. This year, you deliberately picked one that went so far that you knew there weren't going to be any Republican support. The Republicans in the Senate offered a $600 to $800 billion bill. That used to be a lot of money around here that would have been bipartisan. I'm not happy with the infrastructure bill, but it's a bipartisan bill that came out of the Senate with 19 Republican votes. So again, this idea that neither side ever works together or that only one side is partisan just simply doesn't measure up. Both sides can be partisan when they think the stakes are high enough. You think the stakes are high enough here, you're going for it, fair enough. But don't be surprised when you write a bill that no Republicans will vote for it, that none do. That's why frankly, that's why you've linked the infrastructure bill and this bill together, because you're beating your own members into submission. Your choice. I would say you're risking what could be a big bipartisan infrastructure bill, whether I vote for it or not. It clearly has the votes. If you put it on the floor, it would pass immediately. but you've chosen to use it as a weapon against your own members, in my view. So, again, we have legitimate differences. I respect those differences. I know we're not going to always agree, but I don't see one side or the other, and that includes my side, as somehow more or less bipartisan than the other one is. So,
And I appreciate that, and I have nothing but the highest respect for the gentleman, and I think if, when he was chair, as tough as things were, things are different today, and we're seeing that. And I just read you the quote from Mr. Roy, but I could read you a dozen other quotes from people who have said the same thing. And so I just, I hear you. But at the end of the day, I mean, for us, this is about investing in people. And I'm going to tell you, I mean, I don't know how many more years I'm going to be doing this, but the bottom line is that whatever time I have here, I want to fight for those who struggle. I'm tired of poor people getting screwed all the time. And I say that not just under Republican administrations, to be fair, under some Democratic administrations as well. Those who struggle tend to be neglected, fall through the cracks, and it has to stop. I mean, if government is there for anything, it really isn't there to help big corporations. It is there primarily to make sure that nobody falls through the cracks, that everybody is respected in this country. In any event, I now turn to Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your comments and the comments of the ranking member as well. And I'm sure each of us, particularly in this day and age, has spent a lot of time thinking about where we are, how we got here as a Congress, how we got here as a country, given how polarized and how challenging this is. And I speak for myself, but I suspect true of a lot of people that it saddens us that we're so far apart and feels like we can't work together. And maybe it's extremes, maybe it's the media, maybe it's social media and mainstream media, which has made it harder and harder for people to find common ground. I do dare say, Mr. Smith, at least, I understand your perspective. From my lived experience here, I have not met the experience of not having people wanting to work together. I think, when we're talking together in chambers, when we're in committee meetings, when we're just sort of hanging out, talking to one another, I think there's always this kind of desire to work together. Somehow it just doesn't make it through. I'm sorry the ranking member isn't here, but even when we do seek input in good faith, and I think of my good friend who lives just to the east of me, John Katko, who in good faith was trying to get to a deal on a January 6th commission. Look what happened, was given the authority to negotiate that, and yet gotten virtually no votes on his side of the aisle, a handful. I would be pretty unhappy if I were he, but I think that Mr. Cole was making the argument that we're punishing our members. I think in some ways members were punished over January 6th. I talked to a number of Republicans who would have liked to have voted for it. But in any case, I just, the whole environment here of sort of gotcha and let's look to the next election and almost forgetting that there's an American public that's struggling, many, many millions of Americans struggling, and we're kind of talking about who's going to be in charge of the House. I mean, on some level, I'm not sure the Americans care who's in charge of the House. They care about their families, care about their own house, and I care about their house. I'm sure we all do. I was reflecting on projection. We're all talking about projections here. I'm not sure what the projections were of the tax cut value in 2017, but added a couple $2 trillion to the deficit. And so I'm not sure people would have projected it that way. Certainly the people who voted for it, I wasn't here, but I heard a lot of talk about it. And I suspect if I went back and looked at some of the comments by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle about projections, it would have been a lot rosier than it turned out. It reminds me of what Truman said, give me a one-handed economist, because economists say on one hand there's this, and yet on the other hand, I also felt a little bit like that when I see the CBO talk about deficits. It's concern, but what's the level? What should we be at? What should we, what are the constraints? What are the limitations? What are the metrics we ought to use? And you never really do get much of an answer. But what I do fear is when we have these conversations now, I'm reminded of Mark Twain, who often quoted, I think, someone else, figures don't lie, but liars figure. We're all using data that tends to support our position. And I am concerned about the fiscal health of this country, which includes, by the way, not only how much we spend, but how much we tax and whether we're going to tax fairly, whether we're going to have a progressive tax system, income tax system, whether we're going to tax wealth in some small measure to help pay for needed investments. And I do think of investments. You know, it's interesting, Mr. Chairman, you made a great point a number of times that we're not a small business, we're not a family, right? So using those metrics really aren't appropriate. But even still, when I think of a small business, whether you want to expand, you usually don't have the cash available to do it. So what do? You go to the bank if you're a small business. If you're even a larger business or a major corporation, you go to the markets, whether it's the bond markets or you seek other kind of financing to continue to make investments that will ultimately help you to grow and to expand. And even at your home, I don't know, I mean, I'm sure there are some people blessed to be able to pay for their mortgage or to pay for a house with cash. Most people instead go to a bank. And when the value of your house grows, maybe you take out a home equity loan. And maybe you put in a new furnace because that cuts your energy bill and creates savings. I mean, those are all what we call investments. So we have investments we can make, and I think will generate much in the way of the growth of the American public. And many of the, the things that have been said about, oh, we can't spend money if we expand the government too much, it's going to lead to disaster in the United States, most of which has never happened. In fact, we, in many ways, are stronger than ever financially and around the world. But we have moral obligations as well. It's not just fiscal obligations. The chairman has talked about it. Mr. Chairman, you've talked about it. The status quo is fine. Before the pandemic, it's fine, unless you happen to be poor, unless you happen to be black or brown, unless you happen to live in certain parts of certain zip codes in this country. Then you're basically confined to a life that's multi-generations of poverty. Multi-generations of poverty. You know, it's funny, I was talking to an individual about losing my mother-in-law, and she had left an annuity for our family. Very generous, God bless her. And talking to many of my friends who are in the black community, they take up basically collections to help bury people. They don't have multi-generational wealth. They don't have money passed on from generation to generation. There's a moral crisis in this country which has existed not for decades but for centuries. We have young people dying under the weight of college loans. The status quo is not fine. I don't think it's fine for Mr. Smith. I don't think it's fine for Mr. Burgess, Ms. Fishbach, or anyone else here in the Congress, but not sure what we do about it if we're not prepared to make those investments which will make America better. I know we use it as a slogan, Build Back Better. We really believe about that. But maybe, and look, I don't believe we have necessarily the corner on good ideas, but I share other people's frustration that we're not moving, we're not making progress. And again, the status quo is great. If you don't mind living in California with wildfires, if you don't mind living on the coast with rising sea levels, I guess it's okay. It's okay if you're not a victim of flooding or drought or moving because crops don't grow anymore. I mean, these are real crises, and Americans and people around the world expecting us to do something about it. So we do need to push and accelerate the advance of progress. And I do think about the New Deal. I think about the Great Society. Those were great leaps forward, not just because they were Democratic presidents, because they recognize the changing world, that we don't live in 18th century agrarian America anymore. We live in the 21st century globally challenged at times America. And so I would love to work on making sure our fiscal health, not necessarily we just cut the cost of government, that's not necessarily fiscal health. Fiscal health is measured in many ways, and I'm not sophisticated enough to know all of them. I'd love to work with other people on it. But right now, with what we have, with the political system so polarized, so calcified in its polarization, we feel we have to move, that our vision is to try to build everyone in America and continue to move towards that goal of a more perfect union. And so I'll support the rule, I'll support the bill. I wish this was more bipartisan. I wish our conversations were more fruitful. But I wish for a lot of things that may not going to happen. So I'm going to do with what I have, and what's in front of me is this rule, and I'm going to support it. With that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Desaulniers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To Mr. Morelli's point, one of his points, just as a former small business owner, we used to say in the restaurant business in California, you've got to spend money to make money, and you can do that and pay your bills. And I think this is one of those instances. And as a chairman has said, and thank you, Chairman Yarmouth, for your hard work and your diligence that will continue. Look at this budget and the level of competitiveness that we haven't spent enough in these areas in the last 40, 50 years. So climate change, Mr. Chairman, you mentioned this. The Chinese are adding, so we want to be competitive. The Chinese are adding 100,000 new charging stations and hydrogen fuel stations a month. The United States has 42,000 in total. The Chinese have over 1 million. They know that not just that they have to act on climate change, but for the economic future, they have to invest in this infrastructure, which this budget resolution starts to do in a dramatic way, and I think a thoughtful way. On education, Mr. Yarmouth, Ms. Morelli, and I are on the Education Committee. The rest of the developed world has spent 10% on education in the last 10 years. The U.S. has spent 2%. On childcare and early education, Brookings says the U.S. ranks dead last in affordable childcare. Dead last. For working women in particular, working families, in 1974, only 14% of women with children had full-time jobs. By 1994, it was 94 or 74%. Now it's almost 85%. We have to provide what the rest of the world has done, is affordable early education, and this bill will do that. And then something personally that I think is really important for us to get after, that we've talked about in the Oversight Committee, and former Chair Elijah Cummings was so great on this, is the cost of pharmaceuticals. I take a pill every day that costs over $100 in the United States. In the EU, it costs $60 on average. In Australia, it costs $36. When I asked a pharmaceutical executive why that was, his honest answer was, because we can. That's not fair. And then lastly, competitiveness. To Mr. Morelli and the chairman's point, all we're doing is we're going to pay for this the way we did when President Eisenhower was president. We're going to make everybody pay their fair share, wealthy people and corporations. So I just want to again thank you, Chairman Yarmouth and Chairman McGovern, for your leadership on this. I think it's extremely important. In the context of the last 50 years, it's not paying too much, it's paying too little for these important issues. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Yarmouth and Ranking Member Smith, for being here. This budget resolution represents the biggest investment in our people in a generation. It invests in housing. It invests in health care. It invests in child care. And for the next generation, it invests in universal pre-K and free community college, which in the 21st century is going to be a game changer for how we work and how the next generation provides for their families. It also puts the full force of government behind climate change. Again, an investment in the next generation. The resolution looks to the future. Yes, it's a statement of our values, but most of the discussion here today has been about the past. I'm concerned about the future. I'm concerned about our children. I'm concerned about their children. And I'm so proud that the House and the Senate could agree to put forward a budget resolution that focuses on the future. I will support the rule. I will support this resolution. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Neguse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. One of the benefits of being the newest member of this committee is I get to hear all of the debate before I commence with my remarks. And I think today's debate has been illuminating. However, there's one concern I have, which is so much of the discussion has been divorced from the underlying investments that we are poised to make within the Build Back Better budget reconciliation plan that we are debating today. And I think it's important for us to bring the debate back to that core tenet that at the end of the day is the underpinning behind why we're here today. So, Ranking Member and Chairman Yarmouth, I want to say thank you for both of you for being here. I'm just going to go through a couple of the investments, and I guess I'd like to get a better sense as to whether you support them or whether you oppose them. So my understanding is that this bill includes a Herculean investment, as my colleague Ms. Ross explained, in community colleges, making community colleges free for every American. Community colleges in Colorado, state that I represent, in Kentucky, in southeastern Missouri, across our country. Mr. Yarmouth, Chairman, do you support that?
Totally support that.
Mr. Smith?
We have a process called A+ in the state of Missouri, where you go through certain parameters with receiving certain amount of tutoring, community involvement, and academics, and you get your junior college paid for. So the state of Missouri already has a process that they're funding themselves and doing that. I would like to point on the child tax credit.
I'm going to get to that. I appreciate, I appreciate you answering my question. Sounds like a great program in Missouri, and boy, would it be wonderful for every other student in the United States of America to be able to access free community college, which we're poised to do as part of this reconciliation bill. My understanding is that this bill also includes an expansion for the first time in 55 years of various Medicare benefits, specifically vision, so that senior citizens can go and buy eyeglasses when they need them, dental benefits, so that a senior citizen can go to the dentist, and hearing benefits, so that they can get a hearing aid. Mr. Yarmouth, you support that?
Totally. I don't know how you, again, respond to the growing senior population in the country, and so many of whom rely on Social Security for a significant part of their, or all of their income, and deny them the ability to have care for the basic senses that allow you to live your life in a dignified and enjoyable way, hearing, dental, and vision. If you can't see, if you can't hear, and if you can't eat, then you're not going to have much of a retirement. Yes, very important.
Mr. Smith?
The concern under a fiscal crisis would definitely make the programs that are most vulnerable depend on, such as Medicare and Social Security, the most vulnerable. And when you have $68 trillion worth of reckless spending, that only threatens Medicare as we know it, and that is a huge concern. We need to make sure that Medicare does not go insolvent, which is already projected in years to come. Continuing to expand to an already threatened insolvent program is a huge concern, and we need to fix it before we expand it.
Appreciate that. I wanted to make sure I let you finish your answers, but I take that that's a no, that you don't support the expansion of
Medicare is a very important program, and we don't want it to go insolvent, and reckless spending will cause it to go insolvent.
Okay, well, I mean, I guess I hear what you're saying, and I'm not, I don't want to pejoratively describe your views, so you're entitled to your views on this, but I think you could probably fairly say that you oppose expanding Medicare benefits to include dental, vision, and hearing at this time. That's what you're saying, right?
I want to make sure that reckless spending does not destroy Medicare, and this bill destroys Medicare by reckless spending.
I'll reclaim my time. The reconciliation bill includes, as Chairman Yarmouth so eloquently put it, an expansion of hearing, vision, and dental benefits for the first time in Medicare's history since the program was enacted in 55 years ago. Obviously, the American people can judge as to their representatives' views on that particular subject in terms of how they vote on this reconciliation bill. My understanding is that the bill also includes upwards of $18 billion to upgrade various VA facilities across the country. Is that right, Chairman Yarmouth?
That is correct, and you know, I think we have a moral obligation to those who have sacrificed so much for us, and we know that that's an investment that is justified in many ways. But I want to add one thing. When the ranking member refers to $68 billion worth of reckless spending, $1 trillion of reckless spending, he's including Social Security, Medicare, defense spending, Medicaid, and all of the things that this government does. If everything we're doing right now is reckless spending, we're really doing a horrible job and have for a long time.
Mr. Smith, VA facilities, $18 billion upgrade.
When you talk about reckless spending, when you're giving subsidies to wealthy environmentalists,
Mr.
that
Smith,
is
that's not
wealthy
my,
spending.
that wasn't my, and I've done a good job, I think, of being respectful and trying to just, I'm asking you.
In this proposal, you're doing an increase of 16% across the board in everything non-defense related. It flatlines our men and women and our troops, where it actually will be the lowest it's been in 80 years. That's a concern. And when you're putting a priority to our men and women in uniform, make sure you put a priority. But unfortunately, this bill does not do that.
So again, and I think this goes to the point that Mr. Morelli was making around the inability for us to, I think, respect each other's own worldviews. At the end of the day, the facts are the facts. $18 billion to upgrade VA facilities. I was simply asking whether or not the ranking member and the budget chairman agree with that, disagree with it. Sounds like the budget chairman certainly agrees with it. I didn't get an answer either way out of the ranking member, but that's okay.
We should not be spending more on interest than we do towards our military.
Mr. Smith,
we
I'll
should
proceed.
not.
The bottom line, I'm not going to go through the litany of various investments that this bill makes, but I think it's important as the American people considers both the debate that this committee is having today and the debate that we will have on the floor tonight and tomorrow. What is at stake? Because I've heard a lot of noise around supposed concerns with respect to bipartisanship and various concerns regarding the deficit, and very little by way of the specific investments that we are poised to make today if we get this done. Finally, I will just say, I was not here in 2017. My colleague, myself, Mr. Morelli, Ms. Rose, Mr. Eschenthaler, we were all new to the Congress. But I must say, I've done my homework, and reading about what had happened before I got to Congress versus the revisionist history that I've heard from some today during the course of today's proceedings feels like I'm in the twilight zone. In 2017, the Republican tax bill was introduced on November 2nd. 7 days later, it passed out of the Ways and Means Committee on a party line vote. 7 days after that, it passed out of the House of Representatives on a party line vote. The Senate Finance Committee passed it the same day, added trillions of dollars to the deficit. And to now hear folks bemoaning the supposed lack of bipartisanship when we're considering both a bipartisan infrastructure deal that garnered the votes of many Republicans in the United States Senate and a reconciliation bill that ultimately virtually every member of our institution will have an opportunity to shape during the reconciliation process. 13 committees. There's not a single person in this room who does not serve on one of the committees of jurisdiction that will be marking up the resolution. Ours is already scheduled. I think it's I serve on the House Natural Resources Committee. September 2nd, Republican, Democratic members, we will get together. We will have a robust debate about our priorities and where the investments ought to be. We'll negotiate. We will compromise. We'll come up with a finished product. That's what governing is all about. But to hear some of my colleagues on their side tell it, it's as though none of that is poised to happen in the coming weeks once we approve the resolution today. So, again, I am all for bipartisanship and doing our part to try to reach a consensus. I believe that members are going to be able to have an opportunity to have their say in the coming weeks, but they will only have that opportunity if we pass this rule enabling the budget resolution to proceed. And that's why I'll be supporting it. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate your comments. I want to thank both of you for being here. And so while you were talking, my staff kept on texting me and saying to me, like, "What the hell did you just say?" To me, meaning to me. And so I thought it was like, because I said I don't want to see poor people get screwed. That was they didn't like the language. But apparently, in my attempt to wax eloquently, saying I don't know how much longer I'm going to be here. Twitter's like, what am I doing, right? So to your disappointment, I'm going nowhere, all right? And I intend to be chairman of this committee for a very, very long time, and I feel assured of that once this reconciliation bill gets passed and the American people see all the good things in it. So let me clear that up, but I don't know. I didn't think there was, I just was waxing philosophical, and all of a sudden I get in trouble with my communications director, like, what the hell are you saying? Anyway, yeah, you want to say something?
I was just going to
You don't
observe that we would miss you if you
I know
left.
you would, you'd miss me like a toothache.
I don't think you need to worry about the chairmanship position. There are things beyond your control there.
Right, I'm going, anyway, whatever. But thank you both for being here, and no other questions, you are dismissed. Thank you. All right, so that closes the, any other members wish to testify on S-Con Res 14? Seeing none, that closes the hearing on S-Con Res 14. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony in H.R. 4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2021. Chairman Nadler and Ranking Member Jordan, we're delighted that you are here. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Chairman Nadler, for whatever he wishes to say, and feel free to submit your testimony, written testimony for the record, and summarize, do whatever you want to do. Chairman Nadler.
Chairman McGovern and Ranking Member Cole, thank you for inviting me to testify today. H.R. 4, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2021, is critical legislation that would restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to its full strength. It is an urgently needed legislative response to the onslaught of discriminatory voting laws and practices that have emerged in the wake of the Supreme Court's 2013 decision in Shelby County versus Holder, which rendered the VRA's Section 5 preclearance regime inoperative. Before Section 5 became law, states and localities could implement a host of voter suppression laws, secure in the knowledge that it could take many years before the Justice Department could successfully challenge them in court, if at all. Even if one discriminatory law was struck down, jurisdictions would enact another to take its place, setting up a game of whack-a-mole. Section 5 broke this legal logjam by requiring states and localities with a history of discrimination against racial and ethnic minority voters to submit changes to their voting laws to the Justice Department for approval or to seek a declaratory judgment in court prior to taking effect. The Supreme Court's Shelby County decision gutted Section 5 by striking down the coverage formula that determined which jurisdictions were subject to preclearance. The court, however, also explicitly invited Congress to devise a new coverage formula to meet the, quote, current need to remedy voting discrimination. Over the course of 13 hearings during the last two Congresses, the House Judiciary Committee has built a substantial record demonstrating the ongoing and current need for Section 5 preclearance. Additionally, the House Administration Committee's Elections Subcommittee has conducted numerous hearings and issued a report on the matter. The combined record is clear. In the immediate aftermath of the Shelby County decision, several states swiftly passed voter suppression laws, including many state and local jurisdictions that had previously been subject to Section 5 preclearance. Adding new urgency to this already dire situation is the latest wave of voter suppression laws we have seen in response to the big lie that the results of the 2020 presidential election were impacted by widespread voter fraud. According to recent data, 18 states had enacted 30 laws that restrict the right to vote just since the beginning of this year, and nearly 500 other anti-voter bills are pending. Furthermore, as states begin the decennial process of redistricting, unless we pass H.R. 4 now, this would be the first redistricting cycle without the Voting Rights Act's preclearance regime in effect since its enactment in 1965. Without the full protection of the Voting Rights Act, thousands of minority voters could be disenfranchised for the next decade. H.R. 4 is a necessary response to address the critical state of voting rights currently facing our nation. Largely similar to the legislation that passed last Congress, H.R. 4 retains the core provisions of the prior bill while including additional enhancements to the VRA that respond to voting rights developments that have occurred in the interim. Foremost among these core provisions is a new coverage formula that revitalizes the VRA's most essential feature, Section 5 preclearance. This new formula targets those jurisdictions with a persistent pattern of voting discrimination and that continuously moves forward so that it only covers jurisdictions with a recent record of discrimination. The bill also retains a provision creating a nationwide known practices or practice-based coverage formula to supplement the traditional geographic formula if a jurisdiction's minority population meets certain threshold advantages. The most significant change to H.R. 4 is a new provision to address last month's Supreme Court decision in Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee. The Brnovich decision announced several so-called guideposts for lower courts to apply when resolving vote denial claims under Section 2 of the VRA. These guideposts, which had no basis in the statute's text and which run contrary to Congress's intent, appear to have constrained the scope of Section 2. As such, H.R. 4 would further clarify the scope of Section 2 by creating two legal tests the courts must apply to determine a violation of the statute. One for assessing vote dilution claims, such as in redistricting cases, and another for vote denial claims, such as voter ID laws. I also strongly encourage this committee to self-execute my manager's amendment, which makes certain clarifying changes and adds an administrative bailout provision to allow covered localities with no history of voting violations to quickly remove themselves from preclearance coverage. Despite the obvious need for the federal government to respond to the current attack on voting rights nationwide, some have labeled H.R. 4 as a so-called federal takeover of elections. Nothing could be further from the truth. As a constitutional matter, neither Shelby County nor any other voting rights-related decision has diminished Congress's broad authority to eliminate voter discrimination under the 14th and 15th Amendments or to regulate federal elections under Article 1's Elections Clause. H.R. 4 is named in honor of our late dear colleague John Lewis, who along with many other Americans shed his blood to secure passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. At this pivotal moment in our history, when there is a nationwide assault on the right to vote that threatens to disenfranchise minorities across the country, Congress must swiftly pass this critical legislation to protect our citizens and our democracy. I thank you for your consideration, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to you and Ranking Member and the members of the Rules Committee. H.R. 4 is just another attempt to exert federal control over states and localities. It's a partisan power grab. In 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act to overcome pervasive state resistance and barriers that prevented minorities from exercising their right to vote. In 2013, the Supreme Court in Shelby County versus Holder held that continuing to require states to, quote, pre-clear election law changes based upon conduct from decades ago was an unconstitutional invasion of state sovereignty. The court recognized that, quote, the conditions that originally justified these measures no longer characterize voting in the covered jurisdictions. And that's a good thing. It means we've made progress. I mean, we should frankly be celebrating the amazing changes from what was happening, the wrong things that were happening in the 60s compared to where we are today with our voting laws. The court also found that if Congress drafts a new coverage formula, quote, exceptional conditions must exist to justify the extraordinary departure from the traditional course of relations between the states and the federal government. Thankfully, America of 2021 is not America of 1965. As I said, despite what Democrats want everyone to believe, these exceptional conditions do not exist. There is no recent record of rampant voter suppression or discrimination. In fact, minority participation in elections today is exceptionally better than it was in 1965. And during the 2020 election, voter turnout was higher across all racial groups. In fact, from the Shelby County decision, Chief Justice Roberts said, black voter registration before the VRA in Mississippi was 6.4%. Today, or actually in 2004, I'm sure it's higher today, 2004, 76.1%, higher than among white voters in the state of Mississippi. That's what you call progress. That's a good thing. We should celebrate that. Regardless of the data and the Supreme Court precedent, the Democrats still insist that a pre-clearance regime is necessary. The latest version of H.R. 4 is a federal takeover of elections contrary to the Constitution's clear intention. H.R. 4 includes a new coverage formula that would allow federal court to retain jurisdiction over state or political subdivision for 10 years if as few as 3 voting rights violations had occurred over the last 25. But H.R. 4 also takes a novel approach to determining and defining what's a violation, where a state or political subdivision can rack up voting, quote, voting rights violations without any final court judgment of discrimination. Someone just brings a claim. There might be some kind of settlement because the state or the local jury that doesn't want to spend taxpayer dollars or whatever and go through a court decision, and that's going to be tallied up as a violation. Instead of settlement agreements and consent decrees, in addition to court orders and objections by the Attorney General, will suffice to trigger a violation designation. Let's be honest, the real aim of this provision is to utilize the pre-clearance process to allow the Democrats' political allies at the Department of Justice and other left-wing organizations to control state election rules in violations of the principles of federalism. H.R. 4's practice-based coverage provision doubles down on the unconstitutional pre-clearance formula. This provision is designed to target popular voter integrity measures by requiring every state and political subdivision to pre-clear certain election practices, including changes to voter identification requirements and changes to voter registration list maintenance processes with the Department of Justice. A recent poll found 81% of Americans support voter identification laws, but Democrats still want the Department of Justice to weigh in on this. Additionally, this bill creates a new extraordinary legal standard for courts to grant injunctive relief if the Voting Rights Act related actions and impose burdensome reporting requirements on states and localities. H.R. 4, as introduced in the 117th Congress, includes a rewrite of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act in response to the Supreme Court's July 2021 decision in Brnovich versus the Democrat National Committee. Justice Alito, writing for the court, found that, quote, equal openness of election procedures remains the touchstone in establishing whether there is a violation of Section 2, and he set out a non-exhaustive list of factors for courts to examine during its totality of the circumstances review. The Democrats didn't hide the ball with this one. They specifically wrote in H.R. 4 that courts may not consider any of the factors Justice Alito laid out in his opinion. To justify the unconstitutional federal reach of H.R. 4, Democrats have argued that states have enacted allegedly suppressive voting laws. This is not the case. Simply not true. It's easier today for eligible Americans to vote than ever before in our nation's history. Voting remains a fundamental, constitutionally protected right in this country, and Republicans want every eligible citizen to vote and every legal ballot to count. But Democrats and their allies in this administration want to politicize the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. Look no further than the recent actions from the Justice Department. In 2020, we all know about this because it happened in several of our states. In 2020, state and local governments were tasked with administering elections in a safe manner during a once-in-a-lifetime virus. Many states adopted temporary voting procedures to reduce public health concerns, sometimes in a manner that I clearly believe violated Article 2 of the Constitution, despite prominent public health officials saying that in-person voting was safe. But this administration is now telling states that if they want to return to the election procedures they had just 18 months ago, in some cases just a year ago, they could face litigation from the Justice Department. And this same Justice Department, the Biden Justice Department, is refusing to say whether it would review the process by which some states adopted the measures in the first place. So it can only ratchet one way here, according to the Biden Justice Department. And now we see the Biden Justice Department suing states that are trying to improve election administration by implementing voting integrity measures. What's telling, however, is that the Biden Justice Department is targeting only Republican-led states and ignoring Democrat-led states. Imagine that. Such as President Biden's home state of Delaware, that has more restrictive election administration laws than several of the states that have been in the news and have been targeted by this Justice Department. These changes in Republican-led states seek to not only enhance election integrity, but also increase the public's confidence in the election process. This is exactly how our country's voting system was set up to work. States and localities analyze what worked for them during the past election and then make changes accordingly. They do not need bureaucrats in Washington telling them how they should run their election. North Carolina's Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson said it best when he testified before the Judiciary Committee. As the chairman indicated, we've had a number of hearings. Mr. Robinson said this: "We need to stop this. The insinuation that somehow the people in Washington, D.C. know better than the people in North Carolina. You do not, and we will not tolerate it." End of his quote. We need to put an end to these partisan federal power grabs. States are the entities best situated to administer elections within their jurisdiction. I urge the committee to adopt an open rule on this legislation so Republicans can amend it to reflect the realities on the ground and not what's in the legislation. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, can I comment on what was just said?
Yeah, well, all right, let me go to, we'll go to questions, and then you can comment. How's that? Okay?
Well, I just want to say that...
Question, okay, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Or you can, anything you want to say in response to that?
Yeah. I want to say that the claim that H.R. 4 is a federal power grab, rings hollow because Congress cannot seize power from the states that it already possesses. As a constitutional matter, neither Shelby County nor any other voting rights-related decision has diminished Congress' broad authority to eliminate voter discrimination that derives from the 14th and 15th Amendments, the Civil War, the Reconstruction Amendments, and from Article I's Elections Clause. The Reconstruction Amendments fundamentally altered the relationship between Congress and the states, giving Congress broad powers to devise remedies to protect minority citizens' right to vote. The Elections Clause, which has been in the Constitution since the founding, establishes that Congress itself has the ultimate authority to determine regulations governing the time, place, and manner of elections to the House and Senate. So that any claim that we are taking over authority from the states is simply wrong, because the Constitution gives us that power and has since the beginning. As to the claim that H.R. 4 is partisan, this rhetoric is inapropos. I would remind my colleagues that Congress, under Republican control, reauthorized the Voting Rights Act in 2006 for 25 years. The VRA reauthorization passed by an overwhelming vote of 390 to 33 in the House and by unanimous vote in the Senate. President George W. Bush signed it into law. And as to the claim that this is a power grab by the Biden administration, or that the Biden administration is doing something wrong, the H.R. 4 and the underlying Voting Rights Act set out a framework for the Justice Department under any administration to evaluate laws affecting voting in certain jurisdictions. This bill will apply to President Biden's Justice Department in exactly the same manner as it will apply to any future president, whether Democrat or Republican.
Thank you very much. Let me do a couple of things. First, I want to ask unanimous consent to insert the statement of administration policy in support of H.R. 4 into the record. Without objection, I ask unanimous consent to insert a statement of support for H.R. 4 from Representative Jackson Lee. Look, I strongly favor this legislation, and it was written originally, and it's named after our dear friend and late colleague John Lewis, and who said the right to vote is not only precious, it's sacred, and I really believe that. And we have seen a number of states use baseless fraud claims fueled by the former occupant of the White House to move restrictive voting laws forward that really are intended at denying certain people the ability to vote, trying to suppress the vote. I look at the craziness that's going on in Arizona with this ridiculous. Well, I don't know what the hell they're doing in Arizona, but it's just it is beyond the pale. And I really do believe that this is one of these moments where we're either going to stand up and protect our democracy or we're not. So I think this is incredibly important. I never thought that the old issues of 1965 would be the new issues of 2021, but they are. And so, look, I think this is the right thing to do, and I hope that it gets a bipartisan vote. But let's not tiptoe around what is happening in this country right now, and it's really, really scary. I commend you, Chairman Nadler, for bringing this to us. I thank Ranking Member Jordan for being here, and I will now yield to the Ranking Member, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jordan, the Voting Rights Act is permanent law, and it doesn't expire. Okay. You touched on this, but is there any creditable record of substantial and sustained voter suppression going on in the country right now that you're aware of?
Mr. Ranking Member, I would argue just the opposite. We're seeing more participation than we've ever seen before. I think we had 153 million
the highest turnout in 120 years.
Ever. Numbers-wise, percentage-wise, it was getting close as well. So, yeah, I mean, people are, the chairman mentioned we need to protect our democracy. I would just ask a simple question. Is it undemocratic to require an ID to vote? I don't think so. I mean, several states do it. This bill would make it harder for states to enact a photo ID requirement when you vote. And some people read it as making it for current states that already have a photo ID requirement, that they'd have to go check with the Justice Department to make sure that's still okay, even though that's been the pattern in practice in the law in their respective state. So, no, I think it's a great point. You're seeing record turnouts, increased turnout in the African American community, increased turnout in Hispanic American community, increased turnout for all Americans in our elections, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, I would actually tell you, as an old pollster, it's one of the big challenges for pollsters is that the participation has been going up, so the old models in terms of trying to predict an election are getting a lot tougher to get right. And pollsters of both parties have had that problem. Does current law protect Americans from voter discrimination? Is the law pretty clear?
It's very clear, and frankly, that's what we want. If you got something happening that's diminishing in any way someone's ability to go vote, you want people who are doing that, you want them held accountable, and the law certainly does that, and that's a good thing.
And under current law, if an individual voter feels discriminated against, can he or she bring suit?
Sure can.
And under current law, if the Department of Justice feels as if some gross violation of rights, can they bring suit against discriminatory laws?
Sure can.
So, given that, in your view, what's the purpose of the legislation that we're looking at?
I think it's to go after states who are trying to shore up voter registration list and make sure that people who haven't voted in, whatever length of time or aren't supposed to be on the voter list, who have passed away or whatever, make sure that the voter registration list is accurate, and states that want to have a photo ID so that we know that, like in our state you have, when you go to vote, you have to do a signature match and you have to show a photo ID. There are 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats sitting in every single polling station, including Mad River Township B, where I vote, out in the country in Champaign County. It's a good system. That's what we want, and I think it's going to make it tougher for those kind of common sense practices that 81% of the country support to be enacted and put in place. We saw what happened when certain states tried to reform and upgrade their election law. The attack from the mainstream press and from so many Democrats. That's unfortunate, but look, we want everyone who wants to vote to be able to vote. We just want it done in a fair way.
No further questions. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cole. Just a couple thoughts. I appreciate you gentlemen being here, but Colorado, we have a pretty open system that does really allow individuals, anybody who wants to vote, to be able to vote, and we've made it easy for them. And we end up almost every election after election, and this is under Democrats and Republicans, having the highest turnout of eligible voters across the country. We were second to Minnesota a couple years ago and second to Oregon a couple years before that. So, I think the purpose of this bill, and I've been able to support this before, Chairman Nadler, and I certainly support it again, is to make sure across America, anybody who wants, and so I don't know if you had any response to some of the comments Mr. Jordan was just making. If not, I'll pass to Dr. Burgess. Go ahead, sir.
I just want to comment, I think he said that 81% of people support a voter ID law. And there's nothing wrong with a voter ID law properly administered, and that's what the Voting Rights Act gets at. Because some states have said you must have a voter ID with your name and address. Well, on Indian reservations, there are no addresses. So that is discriminatory. Some states have passed voter ID laws that say that gun carry permits are proper IDs, but not state university IDs, and that's obviously designed to discriminate against certain voters and in favor of others. So this bill takes care of that by subjecting all those, like any other voting practice, to the judgment under the Voting Rights Act.
Thank you. I mean, for me, a person's ability to vote is a say in their own future, however they choose to vote. And just as a general principle, it should be easier for people to vote, not harder for people to vote. And quite frankly, I've seen over the course of the last 10 months, a number of states just making it harder, which is the wrong direction. So I'll yield to Dr. Burgess.
Thank you. Ranking Member Jordan, was there a hearing on this version of this bill in
No.
your committee? Has it ever come up in a previous Congress when you have had a hearing on similar legislation? The pre-clearance requirement from the Justice Department, you just make that applicable to every state rather than just certain states, so that there could be uniformity.
Well, I think that's where this is headed. I mean, I think that I understand where you did sort of the premise of your question, but I think that's what they want. They want any change that any state's going to make. I think they now want it to be pre-cleared. That's the direction this legislation wants to go. They want the federal Justice Department, the federal government, to be signing off on any change that states make. And if I could, the chairman said he wants voting to be as easy as possible. I think we all want voting to be as easy as possible as long as it doesn't sacrifice the integrity of the vote. So there's two parts to that. It can't just be, we want voting to be easy. Well, sure, I want it to be as easy as possible, but without in any way jeopardizing the reason you have a photo ID. This legislation will let people come in, they don't have a photo ID, they just attest that they're the person that they say they are. Well, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. That's why you want a photo ID. So that's the problem with this. In the chairman's home city, you can't go into a restaurant now unless you show an ID and show a vaccine passport. But somehow you can go into a place under the Democrats' legislation, you can go in, I don't have a photo ID. Are you Mr. Smith? I attest that I'm Mr. Smith. Okay, you get a vote. That's easy, but is that sacrificing voter integrity and the integrity of the election? I think probably so. Most Americans would agree with that. That's what we want to try to prevent.
But it does just strike me that 1965, my state, Texas, entirely controlled by Democrats, top to bottom, all statewide offices, state legislature, state senate. And the problems existed under a Democratic regime, and it has been corrected now under subsequent Republican administrations. And I'll just offer that and yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Raskin, you're recognized. If you're there. There you
are. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask Nadler a couple questions about the voting rights legislation. In the first place, was there not explicit invitation from the Supreme Court in Shelby County versus Holder to update the pre-coverage formula for deciding which jurisdiction to be covered under pre-coverage?
There was indeed. The Shelby County decision in 2013 invalidated Section 4, which determined which jurisdictions, which states, or political subdivisions of states were subject to pre-clearance under Section 5 on the grounds that it was out of date, that it didn't reflect current data, and it specifically invited Congress to update it under revised Section 4, which is exactly what this bill does.
And all of us can applaud the magnificent success of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in wiping out a lot of the traditional barriers to voting participation. And we know, of course, those barriers go all the way back to the end of the Reconstruction period, literacy tax, poll taxes, character tax, and closure of polling places, hardships imposed on registering to people to vote, and so on. The Voting Rights Act got millions more people involved in American politics and got them the right to vote because it dismantled those racist barriers to vote. And it succeeded in a lot of ways. But is there any reason to think that if we just got rid of the Voting Rights Act and we didn't update the Voting Rights Act, that there would not be further attempts to stifle voting by African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and other racial minority groups?
Well, there clearly would be. At the time of the Shelby County decision, which, as we know, stopped the pre-clearance on the grounds that it wasn't up to date, immediately several states reimposed voting restrictions that the Justice Department under Section 5 had said were discriminatory. And we know that would happen again. It happened before, and we have to update Section 4 to prevent that from happening.
Well, and in fact, are we not living through a terrible onslaught against voting rights across the country today? Are there not more than 400 bills that have been introduced to try to repeal or roll back early voting, weekend voting, mail-in voting, the accessibility of absentee ballots, and so on? In Georgia, where massive political organizing and voter turnout just elected 2 Democrats to the U.S. Senate, including the first African-American ever elected senator from Georgia, they just signed into law a very restrictive anti-voting measure that included making it a crime to pass somebody a bottle of water or a chocolate chip cookie while they're waiting in line to vote. So are we not in the midst of a massive effort to try to dismantle voting in the country?
We certainly are. As you said, we've seen over 400 bills introduced in various state legislatures to do this. And you mentioned the example in Georgia. You have to fill it out. Georgia, in fact, deliberately reduced the number of polling places in minority areas, thus creating the long lines, which it then seeks to make sure you can't help someone by giving them a cup of coffee or a donut or a glass of water while they're waiting on the long lines that the state created by closing the ballot locations. So we've seen a clear pattern in many states. As you mentioned, over 400 bills have been introduced, and we have to revitalize the Voting Act, as we were invited to do by the Supreme Court.
And is this not precisely the role for Congress that's contemplated in the Reconstruction Amendments, in the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment? Do we not have the power to implement the meaning of those constitutional amendments precisely because people's right to vote is fundamental, even against their own state government, because state governments don't have the power to disenfranchise their own populations? Isn't it Congress to be guaranteeing a Republican form of government to everyone and guaranteeing everybody's right to vote?
Certainly, we have that right. As I mentioned before, the Reconstruction Amendments, the 14th and 15th Amendments, were designed specifically for that. And Congress always had that power under the Elections Clause, saying that Congress can define the time, places, and manner of electing Congress, but it had been so flagrantly disregarded that after the Civil War, the 14th and 15th Amendments were added to emphasize the fact, and the Voting Rights Act is enacted pursuant to those, so we clearly have the constitutional right to do this.
And don't both sides accept that federal law is paramount to state law? In fact, I think Donald Trump brought 61 different cases in federal court and state court to overthrow state election results, attacking them as unconstitutional under the federal Constitution. Now, his claims had no factual validity and they had no legal validity, but he was trying to overthrow state election results and basically did that all the way up until January 6th, when they tried to get Congress to nullify the election results being brought in by the governors from the particular states. Isn't that right?
That is quite correct.
Okay, well, Mr. Chairman, I would just say that we not only have the power, as Mr. Nadler says, and the right to vindicate the voting rights of all the people, I think we've got the obligation to do that as the Congress of the United States. I think we've got to do everything in our power to protect people's rights to vote against any kind of hostile legislation that they would face at the local, at the state, or the federal level, we have an obligation as the Congress under the Republican Guarantee Clause to guarantee to people a Republican form of government, meaning a representative form of government with everybody having the right to participate on the basis of one person, one vote, as the Supreme Court has said under the 14th Amendment cases. So I'm going to support this legislation, and we should do everything in our power to make sure that and we are securing the rights of everybody to vote. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Raskin. Mr. Reschenthaler, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And I'd like to just associate my remarks with Ranking Member Jordan's and Ranking Member Cole's. And I just want to commend Ranking Member Jordan on laying out such a strong and compelling case. And with that, I'd yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Scanlon, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, the right to vote is one of our foundational principles here in America, and it shouldn't be a partisan issue. Until recently, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was bipartisan. Since its passage, it's been reauthorized 5 times under both Republican and Democratic presidents, most recently in July 2006 under President Bush, George W. Bush. That reauthorization passed overwhelmingly in the House, unanimously in the Senate before being signed by the Republican president. Now, in 2013, the Supreme Court held in Shelby versus Holder that a critical part of the Voting Rights Act would no longer be enforced because the majority of the Supreme Court thought that it eliminated systemic discrimination of the type which had justified passage in the first place. But as Mr. Raskin said, the court invited Congress to examine the current state of affairs and update the Voting Rights Act. So this is an essential constitutional function that we're performing here. Unfortunately, during the past decade, or since 2013, we've seen that Congress refused to do that. From 2013 to 2020, the Republican Party controlled one or both houses of Congress for the past 4 years, the White House, and refused to respond to the Supreme Court's invitation. In addition, since the last census and redistricting, we've seen Republican-led radical and extreme gerrymandering efforts in my home state, and we've seen the enactment of numerous measures that make it harder eligible voters to exercise their right to vote. Now, not every state is going to be as lucky or unlucky, depending on your point of view, as my state was, because in our state, after enacting a series of voter suppression measures, Republican leadership got up in a meeting and in a recording said, yep, we gerrymandered, we enacted a strict voter ID law, we did all these things so that we could win elections, just for power purposes. And that helped people overturn those laws because there was a clear discriminatory intent. You know, we're not always going to get so lucky to be able to have a guy on tape, but it's important we update the Voting Rights Act to be able to address voter suppression tactics at the outset so that we don't have to go years, sometimes decades, when people's right to vote has been infringed. You know, it's not that the principles here have changed. It's that the Republican Party has changed, and it's fallen further under the sway of the radical right, and that's why it's a partisan issue here. Chairman Nadler, you talked a little bit about some of the work that's been done in response to the Supreme Court's invitation to hold hearings and update the Voting Rights Act. Can you just summarize what has happened in Judiciary and with respect to the House Admin Committee?
Well, in Judiciary, we have held 13 hearings on this question. The House Administration Committee held, I think, 5 more hearings, and all on this question in this Congress. So the hearing record, we've created a very lengthy and detailed hearing record.
Thank you. And as Representative Raskin and I have participated in both those committees, I think the evidence is robust to support the legislation that's being put forward. So I urge everybody, whether in Congress or in the general American populace, to support this reauthorization. And with that, I yield back.
Representative Scanlon yields back. Representative Fishbach, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just very quickly, Chair Nadler, you said 13 hearings, and I know maybe I lost count, but none of them were specifically on this bill?
They were on this bill, yes. In the 116th Congress, in addition to this, we passed this bill in the 116th Congress.
Okay, so before my time. Right. So I've never been to a hearing that was specifically on this bill. So this Congress has never dealt with it. Is that the way I'm understanding it?
Yep.
We held those hearings in the 116th Congress, but the bill is substantially the same.
Okay, but there were many of us who weren't here and had no input onto this bill. And I just wanted to clarify that.
Excuse me, I wanted to clarify. You will recall we did have a hearing last week.
On voting rights, not on this bill.
Right.
On many of the issues contained in this bill.
Okay,
yes.
okay. Well, and Mr. Chair, Chair Nadler, I was just trying to make sure I understood exactly because you said 13 hearings and I didn't recall one on this bill.
The bill was introduced 6 days ago.
Thank you. And and Ranking Member Jordan, well, I've got your attention. You know, I mentioned that we sat through quite a few. I think there's 6 in the subcommittee that alone that I sit on. And I'm just wondering, you know, do you feel, Ranking Member, that there is a real need for this bill? I mean, are we seeing that there's some dire situation and things that you can point to? I know you kind of mentioned it in your opening, but I guess I'm just, after the kinds of
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question. The chairman just said a few minutes ago that since the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County in 2013, so 8 years ago, he said there's been all kinds of voter suppression acts enacted and everything else. Well, if there have been, they're certainly not working. I mean, here's what the Chief Justice said. Black turnout in the most recent election exceeded white voter turnout in 5 of the 6 states originally covered by the Voting Rights Act. So if there's been all this suppression that previous Democrats speakers have talked about, I'm sure it isn't working very well because we have record turnout, which is, as we've said now multiple times, the ranking member said it, I think all the Republicans, is a good thing. So of course that hasn't happened. I was also amazed by the previous, the gentlelady from Pennsylvania. She said, Republicans have engaged in extreme gerrymandering. And I almost started laughing because she comes from the state where the state Supreme Court, controlled by Democrats, just redrew all the districts in Pennsylvania in the middle of the 10-year cycle. And yet she has the nerve to say, oh, Republicans have engaged in extreme gerrymandering when their state Supreme Court did that. We all know we've had colleagues who were impacted by that. So again, I guess you could say all kinds of things, but it's nice if it's actually backed up by fact. And the fact is, we have record turnout. If there have been voter suppression acts passed in the last 8 years, they sure aren't working very well because record turnout amongst all groups, particularly African Americans, which, as I said, exceeded white turnout in 5 of the 6 states originally covered by the Voting Rights Act.
Thank you, Ranking Member. And Ranking Member, Section 3 of the bill, it creates a retrogression provision. I'm wondering if you could speak to that because it seems like this language is very broad and open-ended.
Right, and the general concern, I think, I appreciate bringing this point up as well. The general concern is this requirement that now to do anything different, you got to get an okay from the federal government. It's going to make it, I think, real. I think the focus is on voter ID, photo ID requirements. Third, I think, is this idea that certain states have a pretty strong photo ID, voter ID requirement. That may be in jeopardy current law. They may have to get the okay from the federal government for what they've been doing, have been doing, and are currently doing. And then finally, the fourth thing I think is all part of this that concerns me is this idea that you're going to have this tally. If you have some liberal interest group that sues your state on some concern about the election law, and you enter into some kind of settlement, some kind of consent decree, that's going to be counted as a mark against you, and it's going to further, you get so many bad marks, we'll call them, you're going to have the Justice Department coming after you as well. So that's all part of this concern I think we have with the legislation, not to mention the main point we made, which is we're just not seeing it. There's record turnout amongst all groups in the country.
And finally, Ranking Member, there is the provisions with the Attorney General and their ability to kind of reach in and before there's even real proof or anything, and I don't know if you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, I'm sort of, I guess I said some of that in my previous answer. What also concerns me about, and I think I had this maybe in my opening comments, is this idea that for those states, if you remember when Attorney General Barr left, he said if your state goes back to the law it had pre-pandemic, pre-COVID, you're fine. If you go back to the law that they had been in effect just a year ago and had been working fine and never had a problem, no Justice Department in the Obama administration or the Trump administration had said any concern about it, that was presumed fine. Now the Garland Justice Department and the Biden administration is saying, nope, can't do that. If you're going to go back to where you were just a few months ago, that you're going to have to get the okay from the federal government. Meanwhile, at the same time they're saying that, they're saying we're not going to look at changes you made and whether those adhered to the Constitution or in any way may have violated someone's rights. We're not going to look at those. For example, I look at just the simple fact, Madison, Wisconsin, Dane County went to drop boxes. The legislature didn't pass that. They just decided we're going to have drop boxes during the last election. And now if the legislature says, well, we're no longer going to do that in this next election, that could be a concern. Because the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department say, well, that's going to hurt. That's going to be a violation. That could be a concern. When they just did it, the local clerk just made that decision. So that's I think, the big problem as well that we have with the legislation.
And then before I yield back, Ranking Member Jordan just wanted to see if there was anything else you wanted to comment on.
No, thank you.
All right, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Ms. Fishbach. Mr. Morelli is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I remember that old phrase, reading is fundamental. Well, when it comes to government, voting is fundamental, it seems to me. I've been listening to this discussion and watched what's happening in this country over the last several months. I'm reminded, I think it was Alice in the Looking Glass, it's curiouser and curiouser. So I think Mr. Jordan said in his opening comments that this was a Democratic power grab. But I do note in Georgia and Arizona, with elections certified by Republicans, you're still trying to figure out how to overturn and audit the 2020 presidential election. Certified by Republicans, no fraud discovered, and yet there are still legions of people in the Republican Party who accuse Democrats of a power grab who won't even acknowledge the outcome of the last presidential election. I'm astonished. Mr. Raskin mentioned, I had written this down, but some of the reprisals that people in states who voted for Joe Biden, apparently they weren't supposed to because it's a free and open election, unless, of course, it goes in a way that you don't want it to. So I was thinking, as Mr. Raskin mentioned it, you know, how it could be a crime to hand someone a bottle of water when they've stood in line for 3 hours to vote, when they're trying desperately to exercise their franchise, which is the most fundamental of rights. Can't think of anything more fundamental than your right to vote. We don't have the right to vote, we don't have a democracy. We don't have a democracy, we don't have an America, certainly not the one I recognize, and the one I always say I took as an article of faith would be here when I was a kid. If someone could explain to me the public policy value in stopping fraud, do people fraudulently show up and stand in line for hours because they want a bottle of water? Is that the fraud that's going on? Is that what we're trying to stop? Someone hands you a candy bar or a granola bar because you've been in line for 5 hours because they took away polling places and made it almost impossible for you to go to, so you stand in line for long hours? That's a crime? I mean, this is a disgrace. It's a disgrace. I also find it curiouser and curiouser that, Mr. Jordan, you would use 2020 data on election participation when you won't even acknowledge the outcome of the same election.
I've acknowledged the outcome of the election.
Have you? Did Joe Biden win this election? There was no fraud? You're prepared to say that?
He's president of the United States.
No, that's not what I asked you. Did he win the election? You said he's the President of the United States. That's only because we were here while the Capitol was being besieged by thousands of people intent on overturning it and stuck around to be able to confirm the results of the Electoral College. That's why you acknowledge the President.
All I've said is we should look into concerns that lots of voters have. I've never said that he didn't win. He's the President of the United States. But I said we should look into the concerns. I think that's just common sense.
Well, looking at concerns is fine. It's just the problem is
But you guys don't wanna do
after
that.
I don't know how many court cases we
We
never
asked for an
found any.
investigation. You guys said no. We asked for an investigation a week after the election. You guys said no.
Well, I'll tell you what, I mean, I'm frustrated by this, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your good work on this. I think the most dangerous threat to the United States right now after 2.5 centuries, I was with a group of students the other day. I said the most amazing thing that's happened, in my view, in America, although it was an amazing act of patriotism for George Washington to turn over the presidency after 2 terms. I think the greatest miracle of American democracy was John Adams turning over the keys to Thomas Jefferson the first time the Federalists lost the election, and there was no violence. No one contested it. No one came to the Capitol. No one did anything except accept the fact that that was the election results. What we see going on in state after state is not a willingness to accept elections. It's to try to reframe the electorate. It's to try to make sure that certain people don't vote or participate in elections